All right, I think we're going to get started.
It takes me a couple of times.
My name's Ashley Smith. I'm on the editorial board of the International Socialist Review, which is sponsoring this panel. And we've got a fantastic panel, although one of our the members of our panel is delayed in traffic, Dr. Shaik Ubaid. So he'll speak when he comes in. So I'll just introduce the speakers in the order that they're going to be speaking. And obviously we're at the panel on Islamophobia, which is, if you're following what the NYPD has been doing, everybody knows. They've been basically spying on everybody from children to adults to everybody, cats and dogs, and repressing people's right to dissent, protest, organize, be a Muslim in New York and all of New England. They're tracing people all into Yale University, as people know about. So this is a matter of tremendous urgency, and it's the other side, the domestic side, of the so-called global war on terror. So we've got a fantastic panel that will address all the different dimensions of the Islamophobic campaign on people here in the United States, from the NYPD to the NDAA to the war on terror and all its interconnections, preemptive prosecution, everything. So I'll introduce the speakers. Our first speaker is going to be Deepa Kumar, who teaches at Rutgers University, and she's an author of a forthcoming book from Haymarket Press called Islamophobia and the Politics of Empire. And then after Deepa, we were going to have Dr. Shaik Ubaid, but he'll speak when he comes in. He's the co-chair of the New York Muslim Peace Coalition and the founder of the Coalition Against Genocide here in New York City. And then we'll have Steve Downs on the far left, both figuratively and literally, down on the corner there. He's the executive director of the National Coalition to Protect Civil Freedom. And has been very active in Project Salam, if people have been following their work, some invaluable work that comes out of Albany, New York, but it's now national. And then our final speaker will be Lamis, Deek, who's a prominent leader in Al-Auda, the Right of Return Coalition here in New York City, and a very well-known civil rights and civil liberties attorney who's been defending a lot of people who've been subject to the Islamophobic campaign against Arabs and Muslims here in New York City and across the country. So that's our panel. They'll each have 10 to 15 minutes to speak, and I'll just turn it over to Deepa to start us off.
Thanks, Ashley. So last week I was on a panel at Baruch College, people know Baruch College, and it was about Islamophobia, the media, and so forth. And at one point, one of my co-panelists said, the NYPD spying and surveillance on Muslims in the Northeast is actually perfectly fine. In fact, this is how you apprehend terrorists. This is why the number of terrorist-related incidents have actually been going down, because the police are just doing their jobs. And of course, I'm sitting next to her. My eyes are popping off their sockets, falling on the table, and of course I responded to it. But what was disturbing is that I looked in the audience, and of course by this point I put my eyes back in my sockets. I looked at the audience, and there's agreement, right? Not among everyone, but certainly among a section of the audience. People are nodding when she says the police are just doing their jobs and the number of terrorism cases has gone down because of the great job that the NYPD has done. And this shouldn't surprise us. Actually, a poll found that 60% of New Yorkers have no problem with what the NYPD has been doing, infiltrating student groups, sending informers into mosques, going to bookstores, businesses, creating this thing called the Human Mapping Program that the CIA actually helped the NYPD to formulate, which is in essence a process of spying and surveillance. Now, the reason why I think that sections of the audience from last week, as well as this poll, actually think that this is okay is because there's been a climate in this country since 9/11 where there's been a relentless demonization of Muslims. Islamophobia is nothing if not anti-Muslim racism and scapegoating to serve two ends. First and foremost, to win our consent for the war on terror. Right? You need an enemy. You need an overarching enemy, the Islamic terrorist, which then wins our consent to spending trillions of dollars on wars in Afghanistan, in Iraq, and so forth. And secondly, whenever a country is at war with somebody else out there, inevitably there is a war on those people right here in this country. And so what I want to do is, in the time that I have, is really speak to both of these assumptions that have become common sense, that the US should be involved in these wars abroad to keep us safe, that the NYPD should be involved in this sort of surveillance to keep us safe, and puncture these myths and call them out for what they are. They're racism in the service of empire. Now, just a few more quick things about the NYPD scandal. I mean, I have to say that the Associated Press, which actually broke this scandal, starting last August, they've been releasing a whole number of reports. It's been excellent that they've done this because they've opened up a space for the first time since 9/11 where people have actually started to talk about what's been happening to Muslims in this country, Muslims and Arabs in particular in this country. It's largely gone under the radar, right? For many people, this is the first time that they're hearing that Muslims and Arabs have been prosecuted and persecuted in this kind of way. And to some extent, we've actually got some criticism from people in positions of power. So Yale University president, for instance, actually gave the most strong statement against this kind of spying at Yale University. He denounced it. He said, profiling on the grounds of nationality, religion, and so on is simply unacceptable. Similarly, Cory Booker, the mayor of Newark, came out and said that this sort of racial profiling is unacceptable. And Chris Christie, of course, also, huffed and puffed. But his huffing and puffing was more like, why are these people in my kingdom without first asking my permission? Right? But suffice it to say, there's been something of a pushback around this, and it's opened up a space. And I think we should take advantage of the space that this has created to put forward arguments and facts about the reality on the ground for Muslim Americans in this country over the last decade. And so the first thing I want to start with is this threat, this menace of the Islamic terrorist, right? We've been taught time and time again to be really scared. You go anywhere, a subway station or the airport, it says if you see something, say something, and so on and so forth. And you have shows like 24 which reinforce this notion that terrorists are everywhere and that we have to be vigilant. I've been giving a few talks on this topic over the last few years, and one of the questions that I've come to ask to see what kind of impact this propaganda has had is to ask people in the audience, how many people have died as a result of this Islamic terrorist over the last year, over the last 2 years, and so on. You guys are a pretty sophisticated audience, so I won't put that question to you. I'll just say that the answer I get, of course there was one outlier, someone said 100,000, which, makes you think, 100,000, wow. But generally people come back with things like 5,000, 10,000. And just last month, a sociologist, a very well-read sociologist, someone who has a PhD, studies society and so on, he said 1,000, right? That's the figure that people come back with. But if you actually look at State Department figures, the last year for which data is available, which is 2010, around the world, the number of American civilians who died as a result of Islamic terrorism is a grand total. You ready? Drum roll, 15, right? And most of this happened in Afghanistan, which if the US wasn't there, would not have happened, right? The year before that, it was 9. And then a report that was released last month by the Triangle Center based in North Carolina found that of the 14,000 murders that took place in the United States last year, 0 is attributable to Islamic terrorism, as it's called. And of course, what's absent, in this sort of hype and propaganda that's created around keeping us safe from the Muslim terrorists, is we're not told how many people, for instance, have died as a result of workplace-related injuries and accidents, right? That number consistently is around 5,000. So a 9/11 into 2 happens every year to regular workers in this country. You take the number of people who die each year in this country because they lack access to healthcare. That number is 45,000, 15 times the number of people who died on 9/11. But there is no war on corporations. There is no war on the healthcare industry. But there is a war on terror because there's a larger agenda at work. Now, there are 2 lawyers here who can speak to this in terms of how the legal system has been reorganized in order to prosecute and persecute Muslims. But I'll just lay out a big sort of snapshot so people get a sense of where this panel is coming from. This war on Muslims didn't start after 9/11. It actually goes back to the 1970s when President Nixon introduced Operation Boulder, where people from Arabic-speaking countries were interrogated and seen as being suspicious, and so on and so forth. This has continued. It was continued under the Carter administration, with Iranians in particular being seen as suspicious people after the hostage crisis in 1979-1980. Reagan continued it. Bush Sr. actually took it one step further in the form of allowing the FAA to racially profile, particularly Arabs, and so on and so forth. But it was Bill Clinton, actually. It was under Bill Clinton's reign, the 1996 Anti-Terrorism and Effective Death Penalty Act, that actually opened the floodgates to all sorts of practices that then get enshrined in the Patriot Act. And others can speak to this in more detail. But just to give you some examples of what's happened, immediately after 9/11, 1,200 South Asians, Arabs, and Muslims from mainly this part of the world were rounded up, put into jail, detained, interviewed, and so on. Can you guess how many terrorism-related convictions came out of that? 0, right? Another example, a few months after that, the Justice Department created this program called NSEERS, National Security Entry Exit Registration System, which required Muslims from about 25 Middle Eastern countries, as well as North Korea, not Muslims, but you get the idea of who the enemies are, to go and register, right, and be interrogated and so forth. 83,000 people actually registered. Of that, how many terrorism convictions resulted? Well, 11 people, a grand total of 11 people were found to have links to terrorism, and the last time I checked, there was not even one conviction associated with this program, right? And actually, it was dropped as of last year, if I'm not mistaken. It was suspended as of last year. So what we've seen really is the wholesale demonization of Muslims and the idea that you're guilty if you're Muslim, right? Guilty until proven innocent. And so the question, of course, is why? Why has this actually taken place? And as I said earlier, societies at war are prone to not just creating an enemy out there against whom war must be waged, but do that internally as well. So for instance, during the First World War, Germans faced all sorts of persecution in the United States. People may remember, of course, one of the signature posters from the World War I period, and this was the Kaiser, who was this big monster, carrying off this half-naked woman. And that was used as propaganda to recruit people against these monsters, against these German monsters and so forth. And there were all sorts of reprisals. Similarly, in World War II, after Pearl Harbor, Japanese Americans, over 100,000 Japanese Americans were rounded up, young, old, middle-aged, etc., put into concentration camps. Why? Because the Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor, and therefore all people of Japanese descent must be responsible for these actions, right? Now, of course, later on, several decades later, an official apology was issued. But what about, what happened to the lives of these people in the meantime? And I think that's exactly what is happening to Muslims today. And it's largely happening under the radar until this series of reports that have come to light. It's starting a discussion that I think we should really broaden and continue to have. So how am I doing on time?
5 minutes.
5 minutes. Okay.
Left.
Now, left. Okay. Okay. The last thing I'll say is, so if there is no real threat from the Islamic terrorist, and here again I want to give some figures. The report I cited earlier from the Triangle Center in North Carolina says that in the 10 years between 9/11 and the present, every year the United States has actually has convicted 20 people for supposed terrorist-related activities. Now you have to wonder, why is an entire legal system, why is an entire security apparatus designed to actually go after supposedly these 20 people? And what a pathetic result that after using the resources of the NYPD, of the FBI, of local law enforcement agencies and so on, that this is what we get. We get 20 people. And this is not, and I don't know of these 20 people per year, how many are cases of entrapment. There are these cases that have been put up, the Newburgh 4, for instance, where 4 young African American men were pretty much entrapped by this guy whose picture is there, who not only found the locations of the synagogues to be bombed, gave them bombs, set them up, and when one of them expressed hesitation to actually kill women and children, he barraged this guy and said, you have to do it, you have to go forward with it. And then, of course, when they did do it, this was a complete PR affair, right? There were TV crews ready and waiting, the cops came in, and just like an episode of 24, here were the good guys apprehending the bad guys. And of course, the question that never got asked is this would never have happened had the entrapper not been there. So I want to actually probably have 2 or 3 minutes left. So I want to spend a little time on the politics of all of this. And that is, there's been a tendency, there are a bunch of really good reports that have exposed the far right-wing Islamophobes, a report called Fear Incorporated, which I would recommend that people check out. The far right-wingers are just, atrocious people. But there's been a tendency among the left to see Islamophobia as the kind of language that only the far right uses, or that only the Republicans use, when in fact Islamophobia is a bipartisan project, just as the war on terror is a bipartisan project. And I'll give an example of this. Now, part of why preemptive persecution, which Steve is going to take on in more detail, why that happens, the logic, the theory that's put forward, is the idea that we need to catch these people before they become terrorists, right? And these theories of radicalization have been put forward. The NYPD and the FBI have this 4-step program, and it starts, of course, with being a devout Muslim, and then goes downhill from there. You get the idea. But it's these really reductionist ideas that attempt to capture the complexity of human behavior in 4 steps. It's completely ludicrous. It's been debunked not just by left and liberal sociologists and scholars, but even by a study by MI5. MI5 being the Secret Service agency of the British. MI5 has actually debunked these radicalization theories. But nevertheless, this is not a partisan project. And yet, when Peter King held his radicalization hearings, right, back in February, March of last year, it was rightly denounced as being like McCarthyism, right? But not a peep, actually very little of a peep was raised when Obama released his counter-radicalization strategy in August of last year, pretty much accepting and adopting all of these theories and proposing similar sorts of solutions. So I want to come to a close with this. I think that right now we have an opportunity to expose the systematic nature of anti-Muslim racism. I think we need to read more about it, learn more about it, and we've got to show how it benefits a society geared towards war, and how the war abroad is always and inevitably followed by a war at home, and that this is a bipartisan project, and we shouldn't put our faith in the Democrats, and certainly not in Obama, because while Obama says the right things, his job really is to put a pretty face on a very ugly and racist reality. So let's not buy that, and let's continue to fight against Islamophobia.
Thank you, Deepa. Next is Dr. Shaik Ubaid.
Thank you.
I start by apologizing for being late. Traffic, driving all the way up from Putnam County. I just decided to change and talk to you about what the member of the Muslim community, and especially activists, are going through, and how they are coping with this. Because you will be hearing from the lawyers about all the legalese of this, and you just heard a very good historical background and analysis of what's going on. I will try to focus on why it's being done and who is behind this manufactured hatred. And I will also bring in a unique perspective coming from India, which is the largest democracy, and how things there, drawing some parallels and some analysis from India. I call this a manufactured hatred because all the polls that took place since 2002, it shows a gradual increase in the fear of Muslims and distrust of Muslims. if it was a genuine, and I'm a neurologist by the way, and I know how mind and brain works, and it's just, the fear that most Americans have after 9/11 is a genuine fear. Anybody is scared after such a monumental, terrorist attack took place. The hatred and the distrust should have been the highest immediately after 9/11, but it was not. So what is leading to this gradual increase of hatred and mistrust, which is being now used by the politicians to perpetuate and accelerate the assaults on the fundamental freedoms and on the Bill of Rights and other guaranteed freedoms that we have, and what it might lead to. If you look at who is behind it, the law enforcement agencies will do it because of their training, their psyche. They are trained to be mistrustful and suspicious of people. They even were suspicious of Martin Luther King, who wanted to make this problem an American Christian problem, and not just Malcolm X, who wanted to make it a human rights problem and a universal international problem. So King was as dangerous to the establishment as Malcolm X. So that is there, and that is being exploited. But a unique factor is, as we saw historically, it's not a new phenomenon. It has been going on for the last many decades. And unfortunately, politics is the cause behind it. Muslims are considered as an existential threat to the expansionist policies of the Likud party in Israel. And whether you are a practicing Muslim or not, whether you care about Palestine or not, whether you do, even if you do not know where Palestine is, you are considered a threat. The only good Muslim is not even a dead Muslim, it's a former Muslim kind of thing. So that is the reason you see why Newt Gingrich is getting all these millions and millions of dollars. Why the right-wing evangelical fundamentalists have coped up and are in cahoots and in bed with the right-wing Zionists. So this has led to a continuous and constant demonization of Muslims, and demonization has throughout history led to genocide. So and not for a moment think that America is too civilized or too sophisticated to be committing those mass crimes. I'll give you an example of India, Gujarat, the state where Gandhi was born. Today, if you take a poll of the high school students about Gandhi, which they did a few years ago, less than 4% think that Gandhi was the hero. 17% thought that Hitler was the hero, and Hitler is not even Indian. How did that happen? And the state where Gandhi was born is led by a fascist party. I'm not throwing away the term fascism just lightly. This party was founded after the responders went and met with Mussolini, and they founded RSS on the basis of Italy's fascist party, and later they took Hitler and Nazism as their role model. And then in 2002, in the post 9/11 world, they thought that the world will not care. So for political purposes, a pogrom took place in India. The party was trailing badly. They lost a couple of by-elections. A train of Hindu militants caught fire. Until now, nobody knows how that happened. And immediately after that, a well-programmed, well-orchestrated pogrom was unleashed. More than 2,000 people were killed, more than 500 women were gang raped, and these are conservative figures. More than 150,000 were displaced. This happened in the land of Gandhi, in the state where Gandhi was born. And America was founded on a big genocide. Native Americans were first demonized, and the only good Native American was a dead Native American. And then we saw what happened to the population of Native Americans in America. African Americans were demonized as subhumans, and you can see pictures of women in their Sunday clothes with holding the hands of their little babies, standing there and enjoying lynching, and African Americans being roasted alive. So when a human being is made to fear someone, not only hate but fear someone, then it can lead to murders and murders at a mass scale. 90%, more than 90% of snakes are non-poisonous. But our basic reaction is when you see a snake, either you run away or try to kill it. So when Muslims are being made, into these big demons, that is leading to this gradual increase in and sustained increase in Islamophobia and hatred of Muslims, and that is leading, the politicians, who can sell their mothers. That's why most of them are there for their own good, to join this bandwagon. So the people who are behind it are evangelical fundamentalists who think that Islam is evil and Muslims have to be saved, and then the right-wing Likud party members and the right-wing of Israeli party who think that Muslims are an existential threat, and then the politicians seeing where the wind is blowing, joining it, and that has led to a tremendous assault on the civil rights of not only Muslims, because remember, as you all, I'm new in this country, so and do not know much about history, but throughout history that has happened in America, from time of Andrew Jackson to even Abraham Lincoln, what he did, Woodrow Wilson. So when this war, like Deepa talked about, this war that is raging outside, the war of terror, it is a war that will have to be by nature waged inside the country also, on the enemies, and Muslims will not be the only enemies. You can very easily unleash the genie of hatred from the bottle, but it's very, very hard to put it back in, and we see this happening in India. We see, here at least after 9/11, no pogrom took place, and being practiced Muslim, I said thank God for that. But it can, the way things are going, in America, NYPD is spying on us, but they are not engaged in fake encounters. That's happening in India. We have, documented cases of, literally hundreds of cases of innocent men, women, and even children who are not only in jail but are also killed in fake encounters. And then, and the people are sitting in jail for indefinite periods of time. And I had never thought that I will be fighting, these draconian laws in America. If you read articles especially by Greenwald, you will see all this, the debunking of this mythology that indefinite detention will not apply to Americans. Indefinite detention does not, broaden the scope of whatever is there in existence. At the same time, coming back to the NYPD's assaults on Muslims of New York. Again, drawing a parallel between what happened in India. When they have data bank of which apartments belong to Muslims, which business belong to Muslims, where they are living, it led to, in 1992, all over India, after Babri mosque demolition, mostly in Bombay, but all over India, targeted killings of Muslims. Same thing happened in Gujarat. Why does NYPD need to know where the Muslims are living? What are their businesses? Where are the beauty salons, and where are the restaurants? And then we see that, like I said, it's just not being limited to Muslims. We see other South Asians, other people of color being caught into it just because, they look like them, or the businesses are being, catered to by other people. So, in this atmosphere, I belong to an organization called Muslim Peace Coalition. We realize that the allies of Muslims and the allies of the rule of law and Bill of Rights and the Constitution are mostly the people who are, anti-war groups, peace activists, people on the left, whereas so far the efforts mostly have been geared towards somehow getting political empowerment by quoting the politicians, and that's not going to happen. So what we, especially those of us who have been active, either from the African American background, who very clearly can see what's going on, but also immigrants, we got together and we formed this coalition called Muslim Peace Coalition, working closely with United National Anti-War Coalition and other peace groups. And when the Peter King hearings took place, and I happened to be from the Westbury Islamic Center before I moved to Putnam County, where Peter King was one of the persons who opened the new building. And it was a very calculated decision on his part to become an anti-Muslim bigot, because by that he can win elections and get all this funding and become an expert on national security. So what we thought that, only from a strategic point of view also that to counter this tide. At the same time, from a principle standard, this assault is just not on American Muslims. This assault is on all Americans, on all human beings, because America's reach is global, and and we see what happened to Murat Kunas, who was picked up from Bosnia, even though the Bosnian government, Bosnian High Court has ruled out that he has nothing to do with terror, and spent years and years in Guantanamo Bay, and then he wrote a very moving article of what happened to him. So this is an assault which is on all Americans and all all people of the world. So I think the best way of countering this is while the lawyers will lead the fight in the courts, but then Andrew Jackson said let the Supreme Court execute or implement a decision. I think we have to change this whole public opinion, and that will be done if people who are not Muslims, people who don't look like Muslims, because unfortunately, even though America was built on slave labor and a great segment of the slave laborers were Muslims, but unfortunately over the last many decades, the successful campaign had led to this Muslims being some foreign guys, people like me with a beard and with an accent that everybody should be scared of. Even though when you come to the emergency room, I'm the one who's saving your life when you come with this stroke. But if people who don't look like this Muslims, who don't sound like Muslims, and then can communicate, then common Americans who have now been taught to hate and to fear Muslims will be able to grasp what's happening. So that was the whole thing, and that's why when we led this campaign against Peter King, we worked with Pax Christi and Interfaith Alliance and other groups in Long Island, and they led the movement while we were part of that. I mean, we were not hiding also. Mm-hmm. Similarly, for the NYPD, we see that, continuously things are leaking out in the press as to how extensive this surveillance of the police is. But then the support, on the other hand, you see the support of the police is also growing in the New York population. So unless New Yorkers start to see what's happening, in a post 9/11 city which was so heavily traumatized, it's going to be an uphill battle. But unless the New Yorkers start to see the great dangers, the long-term dangers that lie ahead, once our rights are compromised, the politicians will not care. We can have as many press conferences as we want, we can have as many rallies where not many people attend them anyway. So they will not. So, so what we are hoping is that people like you who are leaders and who are well aware of what's going on will accelerate their efforts and will take it to the next higher level, and will form a network all over the country and try to change the public opinion. That's what is going to be very, very important, because without that, we are not going to win this war. Japanese Americans suffered a lot, but it was for 5 years. This has been going on for many decades, and there's no end in sight, unfortunately. So I hope that meetings like this and other efforts that we are having will lead to that result. Thank you so very much.
Steve, you're up.
I agree entirely with what you say, by the way. I do think that there is a special obligation on behalf of the non-Muslims to stand up and object to what is going on, because our silence is complicitous. And we cannot allow this situation to say, they are separate, special, different. We are not touched by this. And we know that the famous saying from the Second World War, first they came for the Jews, I didn't say anything because I wasn't a Jew. Then they came for the communists, and I didn't say anything because I wasn't a communist. Then they came for the trade unionists, and I didn't say anything because I wasn't a trade unionist. Then they came for me, and there was no one left to speak for me. Mm-hmm. And that is certainly true of all of us, and I hope to demonstrate that today. By the way, I just want to mention my wife is a quilter, and I'm with Project Salam. I'm also with the National Coalition to Protect Civil Freedoms, and in order to express solidarity, she decided to make a banner out of our logo and hang it up. And this is the first time I've ever hung this thing up. And I would like to be able to tell her that when it was unveiled, there was applause from the audience. Thank you. She'll be deeply appreciative of that. Now, the other thing I just wanted to mention here quickly is this is a wall of names. And I always like to bring this wherever I go to some place. I want to bring this wall of names because I don't want this thing to become an academic debate about high, lofty legal principles. We're talking about real people, real suffering here about a large group of people. There is about 150 names on this wall, but in our database at Project Salam, the National Coalition, we have about 739. Kathy's in charge of it.
Yeah, there's a few duplicates. We have like 780, but then there's a bunch of duplicates.
All right.
Probably around 750.
750 names. So I would need 12 of these just to cover the cases, 12 panels, just to cover the number of cases that we are handling. And of course, we don't have time to talk about all of them, but each one of them is individual, and each one of them deserves respect and attention. I wanted to back up just a little bit at the beginning to try to frame this from a legal point of view, because I agree entirely with what the prior people said. This is a movement, it's a time in history, and we have to understand it in that context. But the law is bent to reflect that sense that we're getting from the general public about this fear of Islam. In a sense, war and law are opposites. In law itself is supposed to apply to everybody equally, right? This is why we have the law, so that everybody is treated equally. In war, we single out a particular group of people and we target all our resources on them. And they are the enemy. So in a time of war, we try to mobilize all the resources of the community to bear on the enemy. And unfortunately, one of the resources that gets drawn into this is the law itself. The law that is supposed to treat everybody equally gets drawn in to start to treat one group of people differently. And I think the best example of that, by the way, is the Japanese internment. You remember this is during World War II. They passed a law that said that anyone of Japanese ancestry, imagine that, ancestry, you could be a U.S. citizen, but as long as you were Japanese ancestry, you had to be moved to a concentration camp away from the West Coast. And Fred Korematsu challenged that, went all the way to the Supreme Court. Supreme Court said, yes, that was proper. It was okay for the law to discriminate against Japanese at that time. And I think there's an interesting sequel to that in that Fred Korematsu, many years later, brought a challenge to his conviction on the grounds, and it was eventually overturned in the lower courts, on the grounds that at the time of the argument in the Supreme Court, the Solicitor General representing the United States lied to the Supreme Court and said that there was a study which showed that the Japanese were a security risk. In fact, there was a study, and it showed just the opposite. And it showed conclusively. And so I've often used this as an example that when the law is used as a weapon of war, truth is usually the first consequence, the first casualty. And I think that the Korematsu case is a great example of that. After World War II, we sort of slid seamlessly into the Cold War. And this was also a war of ideology. It's against ideology. In this case, where you have these very asymmetric wars, ideology itself becomes like guns and bullets and tanks. And so we had the witch hunts and things like that. And we've had ideological warfare before. We had the Palmer raids, communist witch hunts, all of these kind of things. So there has been a kind of a continual battle of ideology. But I think it's important to note that in these cases, in each case, they tried to draw this back to a foreign country of some sort. Then, again, we moved seamlessly after that. As the Cold War was winding down, we moved as a country into a series of battles over ideology, domestic ideology. There became liberation movements. There's the Puerto Rican liberation movement, and the Native American liberation movement, and the Black Panthers, and so on. And the government decided to treat this, again, as an extension, I think, of the Cold War, and they used a lot of the techniques that were used then. We had the smearing and the sneering and the disruption, the activists going in and the FBI going in and disrupting activist meetings. And they went even further, particularly with the Black Panthers. They actually engaged in framing people for murders. I included them on here because I just wanted to make sure that we never forget that a group of people, and I have here Fred Hampton, he was assassinated. Mark Clark was assassinated by an FBI concocted scheme, although it was by the Chicago police. Mumia Abu-Jamal, Jamal Al-Amin, Ralph Brown. These are some of the people from that era, still in prison, some of them, that we should not forget, because they are victims of the same process that we have here. But one of the things that was different was that after this period began to come to a close, there was an investigation by Congress, the Church Committee, and they came out with a group of findings on this, and they said this is absolutely unforgivable. You cannot do this in a democracy, to have the government turn on people and prosecute them and harass them and act illegally outside your own boundaries against your own domestic people. And I think somehow in there is a line that was drawn between attacking foreign ideologies, which I think is wrong, I don't think you should be doing it, and domestic ideologies, liberation groups and so on. And I think that's one of the important distinctions that we're going to see today, one of the issues that comes up in the present situation. All right, so what does the present situation look like? Well, we have clearly a war against something going on. What is it? They call it a war on terror. But what is that? The Patriot Act has defined this thing so broadly that it would include almost a large part of what we consider normal dissent, because obviously terror has to do with influencing governmental actions taken to influence government policy. And so if we take that, of course, you're already framing this as a debate against dissent. So if it's a war on ideology, I would suggest that rather than calling it a war on terror, it's probably more accurate to say a war on ideology. And what the government is essentially doing is going in and looking for ideology that suggests that people might do something in the future that would cause harm to us. And if they can find that kind of ideology somewhere in that person's background, they are then going to act to preemptively prosecute that person to prevent them from actually committing a crime. And that's where the term preemptive prosecution comes from. You prosecute the person before they commit a crime based on the presumption that if they have a particular ideology, they may be sympathetic to committing some sort of a crime in the future. Now, is this profoundly illegal from our point of view? Of course it is. You're not supposed to ever prosecute somebody for a crime they haven't committed. And I think one of the best proofs of it is if you look at this list here, look at there's a large number of people here. How many people on this list, and I calculated roughly, my guess is the average jail sentence that they're serving is about 20 years. Some of them are serving life sentences, some of them have less sentences, but I would say the average jail sentence on here is about 20 years. For 20 years, you'd think you would have probably committed a pretty bad act somewhere along the line. Of all these people on this list, there's not a single death. Not even a single attempted death. There is no property damage. Nothing happened. These are all happened preemptively. And of course the government would say, yeah, well, duh, that's what we're doing. We're prosecuting these people before they can do something. And my answer to that is, you can't prosecute people for crimes that they didn't commit. And one of the best examples of that, I think, and I just want to mention this because I think it's important, they talk about, and I will talk just a minute about how they go about this, but one of the things they focus on are foreign terrorist organizations, designated foreign terrorist organizations. And the operative word there is foreign. Foreign designated terrorist organizations. We have plenty of domestic terrorist organizations. We have the Ku Klux Klan, we have the Aryan Nation, we have a whole bunch of these people. And they have training bases and they indoctrinate people in hate and they go marching around with guns. All of that is protected by the Constitution.
Yep.
All of that is protected by the First Amendment, the Second Amendment, and so on. The foreign terrorist organizations, they have passed special laws called material support for designated foreign terrorist organizations, and guess who that takes into account? Well, that focuses all of the legal guns on immigrant communities, Muslim communities, all sorts of other people who happen to be somehow ethnically related to the organizations that we are designating as terrorists. With domestic terrorist organizations, the FBI observes them. They wait until they might actually commit a crime, until they can put together and say this is a conspiracy to commit an actual crime. With the foreign designated terrorist organizations, they're preemptively prosecuting them before they ever get there. When they go into somebody's house to search on one of these terrorism complaints, they're not looking for guns and bombs and bullets and things like that might have hurt. They're looking for books. They look at articles. They want to show that the person has an ideology that might lead to that down the road. So, what I want to just quickly go through, and then I'm probably already. How much time do I have?
You've got 5 minutes.
5 minutes. Yeah, you're so good. They're really essentially
It's true, I wasn't lying.
There's essentially two. All right. Okay. There's essentially two ways that they do it. One way is through material support for terrorism laws. They will target you if you do anything that is somehow connected to a foreign terrorist organization. Any support at all. And that can be free speech, it can be charitable contributions, it can be actions that are trying to reduce violence in the world, and probably the best examples of that would be somebody like the Holy Land Foundation, where they were doing charity in the Middle East, and the directors were prosecuted. He was put in jail for 65 years. And his only crime was to build schools and hospitals in Palestine. Everybody conceded that none of the money went to the terrorists. But the argument was because that area was ruled by Hamas and other groups, the very fact that they were building schools and hospitals there enhanced the prestige of Hamas. That was designated support for designated terrorist organizations. So that's the kind of outlandish sort of law bending that you see when law is being used as a weapon of war. And the other major thing that they do when they go after people is that if they cannot find a material support, terrorism support law to get you on, they will try to bring in an agent provocateur to become your best friend, to go in and push you into it. And I think the best case of that would be Tariq Shah, the jazz musician down here. And he was, they signed two guys to him. The first person became so frustrated with the FBI because they couldn't find anything on him that he actually set himself on fire in front of the White House. They signed another guy to go in, and he became his best friend. He moved into his house with him, took lessons from him, and followed him around all the time with a tape recorder, trying to talk him into some sort of a crime. And finally, he got him pieced together enough of a conversation to make the case that he would have been willing to train Al-Qaeda people in martial arts. And so that was the basis on which he was done in. Yeah, martial arts, right. And so there's a whole case on him. So those are two kind of ways that they go after people, and I think the important thing to recognize here is that the facts of the case are not important. These are all trumped up. These are manufactured. This is and Carlos Montes is a great case right over here. This is a wonderful labor organizer who they went after because they thought he was connected with the peace activists. There's a bunch of peace activists up here, by the way. I'm just saying these are not all Muslims. There are some peace activists they're going after. But they couldn't get anything on Carlos Montes. They just didn't have a good case on him. So they went back 42 years into his record, and they found a conviction. And they said, you know, if that conviction was a felony, and he later bought a gun, which he did, that would be a violation of the state law, and so they went after him on that basis. As it turned out, the 42 years earlier was not a felony conviction. I believe it was a misdemeanor. Okay, I'm off. But
No, take your time. Say your last sentence.
Carlos Montes.
Carlos Montes. So, I mean, it's a good example of just to what lengths the FBI would go to get somebody.
So I think that, you know, what everybody's touched upon is what I'm going to kind of wrap up with. And just a little bit about allowed this the Palestine Right to Return Coalition, and it's great that, you know, that's how I'm introduced. But as a natural consequence of being an activist or a community organizer with the Arab community, predominantly Muslim, and certainly around Palestinian issues, my work tends to naturally evolve in and out of al-Awda and onto Muslim community defense, depending on the circumstance. I'd like to pick up a little bit where a lot of people kind of left off, and I personally don't like the term Islamophobia. It seems like some type of contagious disease that is uncontrollable, and it certainly is. You know, what we're seeing happen to the Muslim community, whether it's the surveillance or the predatory prosecutions, is certainly a form of anti-Muslim racism, but it's an attack on those communities because of their political identity, which is also tied to the ethnic and religious identity. So it's not the fact that you're a Muslim and you believe, in God in the way that you do, but the fact that as a Muslim, you believe in the liberation of Palestine, you believe in self-determination and liberation of the Muslim people and their rights to their own resources and against imperialism. So when the Bureau of Prisons handbook says that, a CO needs to teach, has to make sure that there's no political conversations and needs to teach about needs to teach a Muslim inmate about mainstream Islam. There's an agenda, and it's all tied to the political identity which is associated with the religious belief or the ethnic identity. And so when we talk about, the federal courts have long authorized selective prosecution, and they have authorized the executive, right, which runs all law enforcement, to engage in selective sorts of prosecution as when they relate to the implementation and furtherance of foreign policy domestically, right? So when in the 70s, Nixon launched the operation that Deepa referred to, it was tied to the Arab general uprising and resistance to Israeli expansionism and wars, and activism in the U.S. in support of Palestinian resistance to Israeli expansionism. And very overtly, the policy was target those people involved in pro-Palestinian activities, and the federal court said that's absolutely okay and authorized. And it's great that everybody's been bringing up the Japanese internment, but the internment, by the way, was predated by exactly what we're seeing happen to the Muslim community across the U.S. It began with all of these raids. It began with this concerted movement even before the bombing of Pearl Harbor. So this is the typical trend of imperial expansionism and making sure that dissent, in whatever form it comes from, whatever community it comes from, is absolutely quashed. So when we look at post 9/11, the first images that we saw from the Arab world or the Muslim world reaction were doctored images of Palestinians, doctored images, later admitted to be doctored images of Palestinians celebrating in the street. And the first response after the massive roundup, and I was at 26 Federal Plaza and felt like I was back at an Israeli checkpoint in the 80s, before even Oslo, it was so terrible, right? The first line of attack was against all Palestinian institutions that had been built up over the past 3 decades. They were immediately dismantled. They were the first line of attack. And we saw entire Palestinian communities, especially in the Northeast, washed out, right? And that was also the first line of attack in the entrapment cases. And we saw a lot of the expert witnesses that were posed as the government's witnesses on many of these cases, whether the case was focusing on Palestine or some type of support to Palestine or not, were expert witnesses, right, who have long relationships with the Israeli regime, with plenty of Zionist think tanks, right? These are people who are employed by a foreign power, right, directly and indirectly, and that's still the case. Matthew Levitt is a prime example of that. And so it's important to understand that certainly it is racism, but it's racism that's fomented to further imperialism, to further war across the Arab and the Muslim world. And we look at, post 9/11, the Sheikh was absolutely right, that we didn't see the type of backlash that we're seeing now. I've been, an activist and a defender in the Muslim community, even before I graduated law school. Then I graduated in 2003. So I've been at the front lines of kind of seeing everything that's really happening, especially as an activist in a neighborhood that's, a hotspot, high priority target, full of working class and very active, at least vocal Arab Muslims. What we saw 2003 to 2004 or 5, I thought at that time was the climax. I mean, we were in constant emergency mode, responding to whether it was investigations or, you know, police brutality or what have you. But that wasn't the case, because it resurged again in 2008, worse than it was post 9/11. Worse, 2004 was really the height of post 9/11, law enforcement repression. That was outdone by 2008. And in fact, right after Obama was elected, I had, a ridiculous amount of clients and friends picked up, detained, and interrogated specifically on what they thought the Obama elections would do, and what type of response the people in their country would have. I kid you not. It was the most ridiculous thing. And, building up on this, defamation, racism, right? Racism, defamatory racism, defamation, racism in speak, in language, is really the most sinister thing that we have, because it's from this that we're able to normalize. And as Deepa touched, on the issue, anti-Muslim, anti-Arab racism is not new. It's not post 9/11. If you look at the Bugs Bunny cartoons and you see the images of the pot-bellied sultan running around, trying to rape the women and kill everybody, otherwise he's fat and lazy, this has long predated 9/11, and it comes from, the Orientalist agenda of studying and controlling, right, the Arab Muslim world, and then resurged again in the 70s. In fact, and the government knows it's effective, and in fact the government, the Department of Defense itself, funds movies where Muslims are killed, by these heroic Marines, and the audience gets up and claps, right? It's very effective. And it's very effective in creating a society that attacks, right, this population, right, because of their religious identity, when in fact it's because of the political identity, right? But it also allows or makes the subjects themselves internalize, self-police, and stop descending. One of the cases, I've done, some of the material support defense work, but I took on the case of defending the Sheepshead Bay Mosque, which came under attack at the time when, this cocktail of groups and parties had been involved in trying to shut down the mosques. And what was really interesting was that the plaintiffs, who were the racists saying this mosque does not belong in this neighborhood, before coming to court, had drafted and sent out to every civil society institution and local government official letters saying, these Muslim radicals, this is going to be a place for, it's not going to be a house of worship, it's going to be a place for militant recruitment. These are terrorists who danced and celebrated on 9/11. Our Constitution doesn't know how to deal with this. And across the board, right, whether it was NYPD, the fire department, local governance, whoever it was, the response was, don't worry, we're going to investigate them, okay? And that's exactly what happened. Right? All of a sudden, not all of a sudden, I mean, they've been long investigated. After all, they're part of building the mosque. But you have more undercovers hanging out in a car, all the sinister things that you would normally have. Worse over, the people, the builders involved in building the mosque really bought into what they were being told. And what they were being told by these same departments and these same officials was, listen, it's a very controversial subject. We're going to let you build most perfect building permits in the history of building permits, because they knew it had to be, right? We're going to let you build, we're going to give you these permits if you just don't make a big deal about it, right? And so they internalized this, and they said, okay, you're right, we're not going to complain. We're going to deal with the complaints. We're going to have all the work stopped, and spend umpteen, tens of thousands of dollars, because they've internalized that they need to be on their best behavior to be given what they're owed by the law, right? And then this, of course, played out in the plaintiff's filings in court, which were outrageous, quotes in legal pleadings, which happens on other matters that I deal with that involve, Arabs or Muslims, by the way. But, here, it's a high profile case, relatively at the time, stuff like, the attorney saying, the defendants clearly don't understand the constitutional rights of free speech, for which they must be grateful by living in the United States. Most of them are citizens, right? This is not Iran or Iraq, right? A country where we do not. Yeah, I mean, just replete with racism that he wasn't even aware was racist to put in pleadings, right? And so it's effective, but it was effective for a long time, and it wasn't until they had to go to court where they realized, oh shit, we've been, excuse my language, oh my god, we're being taped, that this is wrong. Sorry about that. That this is wrong, right? So it's effective, right? It really does have a way of getting people to be quiet because it's terrifying, and what we're seeing happen through the NYPD, and it's important to note that the NYPD program was set up by the CIA, but it was modeled after and most certainly in coordination with the Israeli programs of monitoring and tracing Palestinians in even what this government calls occupied Palestinian territories, an illegal occupation. I mean, that's very sinister. So we're employing the same tactics on our own citizens that is employed by foreign occupying power. Right? That's terrifying stuff. Add to that the fact that you all know that it's elementary schools, right? I saw the actual leaked documents. And, I was allowed to see them because I had known so many of the people that were listed as top and high priority targets because they were activists, right? Many of them were Arab. And the ones that were really targeted in the Arab Muslim community were, first of all, the Arab Muslim mosques and schools that were high priority were Palestinian run, okay, and started in the majority were Palestinian students. And in fact, they have quotes from people about what they're saying about their sympathy with the Palestinian struggle in the NYPD summary reports. And this is just a master report, so you can imagine what's being said. So it's absolutely, this concern about dissent, right? And it was we'll get to the Farhani case. But so in that context, we have the Farhani case now, right? Ahmed Farhani. There were two undercovers that were sent to target this one Palestinian organization. The undercover cop, this formal undercover officer, spent years trying to get an arrest, right? And there were tons of reports from the NYPD saying that, they didn't find him credible, and in fact, he was being investigated at some point by the FBI, this undercover NYPD agent. But his case, we have good reason to believe, comes directly out of the demographics unit, right? He's going around, the undercover's going around from mosque to organizations to all of the MSAs, right, that were all involved. Spent years doing this, couldn't come up with anything. And lo and behold, he catches Ahmed Farhani, who's mentally ill. And in fact, he's so mentally ill that the NYPD themselves institutionalized him over the course of 11 years. And when this agent came to target him, he had just been released from prison getting, psychological help through the Department of Corrections themselves, right? So perfect target, right? And this undercover started working kind of toward this entrapment case, not sure who the victim, who the next dummy was going to be, right? And he was planted right around the time of the Operation Kasla, the war on Gaza, right? Right around that time, boom, he's in there. Because the movement had come back, right? Palestinians and Arabs were back on the streets in a way that they hadn't been back since 9/11, right? And it was also no coincidence that around that same time, that's when NYPD really let loose on the demonstrators, right? We had a massive, massive stampede. We had kids, women that were maced and beaten up by the police at the last massive rally we had against the attacks, the Israeli attacks on Palestine, and at the same time that Patterson was joining the pro-Israeli rally, I don't know for what they were rallying, which only had a couple of hundred people. So it's not a coincidence that a lot of this, relates to our foreign policy interests, right? And is funded by the same foreign bodies, right? And what we're seeing, this resurgence now, I think, is in response to what is a growing anti-imperial perspective vis-a-vis Palestine and a growing disillusion with the war in Iraq and a lot of the anti-war mobilizations that is happening. There's no question that this is a monopoly on 9/11 and the targeting of Muslims, and then you have this marriage of all of these, who once would be strange bedfellows, right? A lot of these right-wing Tea Party types, hate Jewish people, but they're willing to collaborate and have this vast network of Zionist, pro-Israeli, Israeli-funded, groups coming together and putting a lot of money. And I'm sure that we'll find sooner, if not later, that a lot of this is coming through outside funding and going into the all this party stuff. There's a lot that I missed out on, but I'd like to say, so I'm an officer in the National Lawyers Guild New York chapter by circumstance, because this is where we kind of had to be to build and kind of bridge the gap between the non-Arab, non-Muslim legal community, the activists and organizers, and the Muslim leadership. And we started the Muslim Defense Project, which is doing a lot of work around these issues on a grassroots level and community empowerment stuff. And I'd like, I'm sorry, I know I need to wrap up. I would suggest that moving forward, we understand that the same exact practices that are being used against Muslims right now are also being used against, for example, the more mainstream, the Occupy Wall Street folks, right? They're being targeted, and the same infiltrators, there are drones flying over the OWS encampments right now, surveilling them. Yeah, it's mini drones, they call them. And so it's important to look at this as to the direction that the country is taking as a whole. It's terrifying, really. Certainly as we see, the closing up of the 1% and their fear from the reaction of the masses who are affected by this economy, and really exposing and normalizing, dialogue around the Israeli role in all of this. AIPAC's role in circumscribing our constitutional liberties. We have to talk about this openly, and it's good to see that Muslim organizations that may not have historically been willing to engage because it's such a controversial subject are saying, okay, this relates to our political identity as it relates to the Palestinian struggle. Very critical. And we can't undermine or minimize the importance of Palestine to imperial expansion. Militarily, it is the most strategic part, in fact, right? It's Africa, Asia, Europe, right there. Trade routes, right? That's why there's a world war that's playing out through the Egyptian Revolution. It's very, very critical. And so what happens here, it ties very much to the growing international movement in support of Palestine. And please, we need support for the Farhani case. For right now, I think May 15th is our next date, but we really need people to talk about this. I'm sorry, my last point is, yes, decisions come from the courts, but the courts are comprised of judges who are people, and these people are responsive only to the political atmosphere. Right now, the political atmosphere is worse than it was post 9/11. Until and unless we have people really mobilizing on the streets, on their campuses, campus mobilization is very critical to influencing, in my opinion, what happens in the judiciary, right? If we don't have a new political atmosphere created, we're not ever going to get a judicial decision that says that what's happening is wrong and effectively protects our constitutional right to dissent, because this is what it's all about, to dissent. So thank you. That's it. Go over the place.
Just before I send it out to the audience for comments and questions, and I'll take a round and then I'll throw it back to the panel and go back and forth. Just a couple of announcements. Many of the people who are on this panel are going to be speaking at United National Anti-War Coalition Conference, which is coming up next weekend in Stamford, Connecticut. I know that Shaik is going to be there, right? Okay. I'm not sure, but I'm going to make sure you're there. And I know Lamis and Steve are going to be there speaking on plenaries and in workshops. So I encourage everybody to come out to that. And one of the big projects that UNAC has launched is spearheading the demonstration against the NATO and was going to be the G8 summit in Chicago. And one of the important things that we've included as a central part of that demonstration is not only anti-war demands about NATO and anti-austerity demands around the G8, but also raising the question of Palestine and the question of Islamophobia as an integrated part of our domestic anti-war movement and anti-austerity movement. I think that's an important milestone that we've accomplished in the building of this movement. So I encourage everybody who can come to Chicago on May 20th to get thee to Chicago and all your friends so that we can have a good demonstration against NATO, because they're an instrument of this whole thing that the panel has talked about. So I'll just take a list of speakers. So if you raise your hand, I probably don't know a lot of you, and then I'll call on a group, and then we'll send it back for answers. So go ahead.
You may have already touched on this because I was late, but I noticed in this conflict between the Muslim community and the NYPD that all of a sudden, bingo, there is a group of pro-cop Muslims standing side. Who are they and what are they getting for this?
Other questions and comments?
Just to clear what Lamis has said, am I pronouncing your name right?
It's okay, Lamis, yeah.
It's absolutely a feedback loop between like how the U.S. conducts itself in Iraq, Afghanistan, etc., how they conduct themselves here, and what the Israelis are doing in Palestinian territories. On every level, with the conventional weapons they're using, with the way their police forces help train each other, etc. Kelly, what's his face?
Brown.
The guy from Miami being in Bahrain, training the police in Bahrain. It's like all these feedback loops, and it's really important to have an understanding about that we're learning from the Israelis and we're pushing the envelope of what we can do because we're watching because the Israelis are teaching us how to get away with it in international law.
All right, in the back there.
We're teaching our government.
Yep.
You? Yeah, go ahead.
Okay, great. So I have a couple of questions, and I just really wanted to emphasize, I think this link with Israel and not only the Israeli military, but Zionist institutions here is so important. I do have a question, but just two facts because they're so stark. That the Department of Homeland Security gives out $25 million to domestic organizations for the kind of programs you were talking about if you see something, say something for anti-terrorist work. So out of $25 million they give, $19 million of it goes to Zionist organizations.
What? Really?
$19 million of it. And then the feedback loop, explicitly on a government website that the Israeli, Department of Industry puts out. The Department of Homeland Security Services is one of their biggest areas of the economy. And it explicitly says that they're so good at it as they sell their services because they field tested it, which means Palestinians are the field test for population control all over the world, and they earned $2.7 billion in 2008 in providing these Homeland Security services, and the vast majority of them are, of course, to the United States and India. And so, you just see these connections are very real and very important for us to put out. So I think my question, I had two. One was to you. I think, Deepa, about, the specific racialized nature of the domestic counterpart, like the difference in consequences for anti-German versus anti-Japanese sentiment. Or, the French, the anti-French moment we had here versus the anti-Arab, anti-Muslim racism. So just something about that. And then I think, Steve, first of all, very much appreciate your work, and also just have this thing on it being a war on ideology. I think that's of course obviously true, but it just feels like I would love your comments on. It feels like a tactic because the war on it's sort of like not actually about that. I don't know how to say it well. I think Lamis spoke to it very well, but as you spoke about the national liberation struggles, it's like the war on drugs also laid the groundwork for a lot of what the war on terror ended up doing abroad and domestically. And the war on drugs, Nixon also launched as a way of containing and incarcerating national liberation struggles or other liberation struggles. So just sort of like it's not really about the war on ideology, so then just continuing to talk about what it's about, I guess.
Any other, I'll let them come back in just a second. Anya, go ahead.
I was wondering if we could talk about how to reach, I think everyone here is kind of in agreement with what you're saying, so do you reach people who disagree and the people who need to learn about the dangers of these kinds of laws and the way they're applied or misapplied?
All right, I'll just let people respond, and then we'll go back to the audience for another round. Let's just go from Steve on down to Shaik.
All right. I agree. I think there is a larger agenda here, and I think it follows very closely in terms of what I talked about from the Nazi period, where they had a progression there, and I think the same progression is kind of at work here. You first start with the religious group, the religious minority, and you whack them. Then you go up to the leftists, and you've got the pink leftists up here, the peace activists, and they're starting to whack them. But the real payoff is when you get to labor, because if you can whack labor, that's the big, and so I think you really have to sort of gin up the fear and get everybody really afraid, and then start to work up and see if you can't get a big payoff when you can finally take down the labor organizations. That's sort of one perception I have. The other perception is that I think Israel has put a lot of money into funding a lot of think tanks. And out of these think tanks have come a lot of experts. And these experts tend to show up in court very often as experts on something. But in fact are really kind of a representative of the Israeli point of view interjected into these criminal cases.
Yes.
And one of the things that they seem to sell is the idea of this vast conspiracy all over the world, with Muslims all connected in and how they all work together. If they say nothing more than that, even if they don't know a single thing about the case, that is enough to already push the jury over into a place where they're saying, oh yeah, there is a vast conspiracy, this guy might be part of the vast conspiracy. And I think that is the message that Israel wants to sell, and it's selling. And what we need to do is work up a vast group of experts on the other side who are saying, no, that isn't the way it works at all. None of that's true. Anyway, go ahead, Lamis.
So I want to talk to the woman who brought up the pro-cop Muslims. Interestingly, these same pro-cop Muslims are being followed and surveilled by the very cops to whom they're always running to curry favor. They've been very problematic historically in terms of community organizing, and Dr. Shaik Ubaid will talk more about that, I'm sure. But and Muslim leadership, community organizers, I have to say, Al-Auda and parts of the Federation have not been tolerating them at all. But the larger Muslim community leadership has, just in terms of trying to keep a kind of peaceful front. But I think that they've come with the leaked document. They've come to a point where it's no longer tolerable. They understand the extent of the betrayal that's been happening, and how these pro-cop Muslims have been doing a great service to the NYPD in harming the Muslim community. And so they're usually tokenized. They don't, the majority don't have a massive following, and the few that do have a broader following have one only in terms of their Islamic discourse, and not their political beliefs, which don't really come out. And so the Majlis Shura has been active in calling them out publicly, actually, especially after the leaked document. So, you liken it to the Uncle Tom who gets a pat on the head and gets a few, photo opportunities in exchange for, selling themselves out. And there's always going to be those, and they're always going to be useful. And they have been useful to Bloomberg. He's pointed to them and said, well, they've come to the breakfast. I think the most important...
Are they looking for contracts? Is there some economic...
There's always some type of benefit, right? Whether it's they can point at the newspaper, or they get invited to events, or, it's this internalized kind of, if it's coming from white, then it's right, and it makes me feel better about myself, Come to the event, we'll get your kid a job, whatever it is. It comes in many, many different forms, right? And if it's not to them, it's somebody they know, or to family members. And it could be just, a crumb, right? I think the most important question was raised by the young sister in the green vest, which is how do you reach people who disagree? In defending these cases, the most important part is reaching the jury pool, right? And the jury pool are the people in New York, right? And explaining, getting masses to a point where they say, no, we totally reject this type of surveillance. It's absolutely illegal. We don't want to be subject to it. We don't want our neighbors subject to it. And therefore, the cases that come out, or from this, or an attempt to justify the surveillance, are equally invalid. Now, how do you do that? I mean, that's really the trick. I'd love to see personally, as an organizer, more student activity about this, depending less on what the MSAs themselves do, because what's happened in the MSAs is a lot of them have said, we won't even involve ourselves. If you can't walk into this room if you're talking politics at this point. But if they see that their colleagues, their classmates are talking about it, then they're also going to feel empowered and saying, well, this was us, we were victims of this, and we're going to keep moving forward, and we understand the importance of our work. So, if you're involved in the OWS work, relating that to the interests of the 1%, right? Because that's exactly what it is. All of this is to protect, imperial interests, which are, compounded or owned by these corporations that run the rest of the country, right? To which we're all victim. So it's a struggle, on how do you do this. But talking about it and normalizing discourse against it, I think is very important. And everywhere we go with our neighbors, having these debates, and they're gonna get ugly, right? Especially in New York, right? The home of 9/11, well, also Israeli power base, right? So, difficult conversations to have, but I think that the more we can do them, the more people can learn to see right through them. But I've got no quick solutions. And coming out to the rallies, I mean, we saw in the Arab world, rallies made governments crumble, right? It was the power of the people to literally do nothing and stand in the streets, right? That's what it is, and that's what they're trying to get rid of.
Yeah, I do want to speak to your question about pro-Cop Muslims. And I think there are two strands of people, if you will. On the one hand, there are those who are scared, right? And who don't have any other way of responding to this oppressive state machinery that is systematically used to demonize people. And they don't have an ideology or a set of ideas to respond to this in certain ways. And W.E.B. Du Bois, for instance, talks about it in the form of double consciousness, right? Which is that your identity, your sense of self, comes from the dominant white culture. And so there's, it's inevitable that some of these ideas, these racist ideas, get internalized by people of color in various societies. Frantz Fanon has a book called Black Skin, White Mask, where he looks at what is it like to be a black man in Algeria under French occupation, and how do the racist ideas of the French get internalized by people. So there are people who try to be quote-unquote good Muslims, right? In terms of how the state defines good Muslims. Good Muslims are people who can be recruited to prosecute the war on terror. They are the people who are willing to be the informers. They are the people who are willing to be the translators. They're the people who are willing to go off and fight overseas in the wars and so on. And to some extent, people accept this because there isn't a strong enough anti-war movement. There isn't a strong enough anti-Islamophobia movement that can offer alternatives. And I don't think we should be blaming those folks for trying to be good Muslims and to trying to stay under the radar and so on. But the people I will blame, and I do blame and constantly blame, are those who make a profit, who make money, actually doing a circuit, doing tours, organized by the Department of Homeland Security, whose main job it is as people, as brown-skinned people, to legitimate the racism coming from the top of society. There's a group called Former Muslims United, which consists of immigrants from all parts of the world, Lebanon, Egypt, and so on, people like Wafa Sultan, Nooni Darwish, and so on and so forth. What these people do is they spread the most horrible propaganda. They say, well, I grew up in Lebanon, or I grew up in Palestine, and you want to know what Muslims are like? They are the most nasty, anti-Jewish, anti-Semitic, right? So what do? They legitimate and they make credible the sort of propaganda that comes from the top of society. And these people get paid for it. Homeland Security pays this guy who's an evangelical Walid Shobat, who goes around saying that the end times prophecy is going to be one where Satan is going to have Muslims fighting with the Christians and everybody else. This is what he really believes. This is a nut job evangelical. But Homeland Security pays him to go speak at conferences. right? So these are the people I think that we should be targeting. And of course, the more sophisticated counterparts are the Ayan Hirsi Alis, who had this appalling front page story in Newsweek a couple of issues ago, basically demonizing Muslims, but in sophisticated language. She is a recruit of the neocons. She works for the American Enterprise Institute. Same with people like, what's her name, the book Reading Lolita in Tehran. Do you know who I'm talking about?
Yeah.
Reading Lolita in Tehran was on the New York Times bestseller list for 100 weeks. It's required reading in English courses and so on. And what it is just the undiluted peddling of the idea of the white man's burden. Iranian society is just so backwards that we need the white man to come and liberate us and so on. So these people are involved in really profitable enterprises in propping up this ideology, and I think we should, call them out for who they actually are. A book I would recommend on this topic is Brown Skin, White Mask by Hamid Dabashi. He calls these people native informers, and that's exactly what they are. Very quickly on the difference between, anti-German versus anti-Japanese and anti-Muslim racism, very quick. I mean, I point to anti-German racism to say that enemies will be constructed whenever they need to be constructed. But in no way, shape, or form is the racism against Germans the same as those against people of color. Let's be clear about it. The consequences for the people of color are much more devastating. Finally, how do you reach people? Very quickly, I mean, in Rutgers is one, I teach at Rutgers, is one of the places where the NYPD has been involved in this sort of snooping. In fact, 2 years ago, we discovered this because one of their safe houses, just off my campus where I teach, was busted because the landlord, the supervisor, thought that there was a terrorist cell at work there and reported them to the local cops, and then they found it was this NYPD cell that was actually operating there. So that's what, that's great. So that's what has been happening for several years. Our administration, Rutgers administration, has done nothing about it. So what we did in the union is we passed a resolution basically comparing what's going on right now to COINTELPRO, to the attacks on Martin Luther King and all the rest of it, and said, you, the president, have got to take a stand and actually call this out. And he did. He actually, under pressure from the faculty union and the graduate student union and so on, actually took a position. Although he used the word alleged spying, I want to say 12 times, like as if this is some sort of mythical thing that needs to be investigated. So I think wherever we are, right, we've got to get organized in the spaces that we have, and we have to push back. I mean, presidents will never do anything. People in positions of power never do anything unless there is pressure from below by people who get pissed off with this sort of thing and make them, say things that they may not normally say.
Go ahead, Shaik.
I will also start by answering that question. Malcolm X's famous speech, the house Negro and the field Negro. So some of them are the house Negroes. Like you said, they are trying to survive. But then some of them are the overseers who bash and kill their own kind. I will also cover one more aspect of it. Even people like Salman Rushdie. Some of the people from the left. Have been complicit in that, and even people like now who's coming as an expert, now a professor at NYU. I'm forgetting the name. Sleep deprivation does it to you. I have been on call for a long time. The lady who from East African descent who comes quite often on CNN. Forgetting them anyway. So all this liberal, leftists, when it comes to Islam bashing, all of a sudden there's no difference between them and the neocons. So that is it. But again, why I brought the Indian angle was Time Magazine's cover on this 10th anniversary of the Gujarat pogrom is this pogrom politician Narendra Modi this week in Times Asia. And yesterday till like 3 o'clock we were having this conference calls with India and everywhere. The media itself, it's height of insensitivity to say the least. So unless the quote unquote mainstream media, the quote unquote liberal media, and unless the liberal writers and everybody else try to see what's going on and how this slippery slope will lead to a completely police state, things will not change. We will have to make our fellow citizens believe that it's not the Muslims they have to fear. It is the fear mongers that they will have to fear. do you want to live in a country where your children will not have any right? I mean, going to the colleges, they will be spied upon. You know,
Without a doubt.
I mean, so again, because India is a democracy, and I saw when I went to the 8th grade, I saw what happened. This liberal left-leaning politician Indira Gandhi all of a sudden took away all our rights, and I saw the fear. For 2 years, I saw the fear that my elders and others were living in, and again, the minorities were faced the brunt of it. And I don't want that to happen in America, and it's happening. And it had happened periodically in America, but every time, people like King and others took it to the next level. But how long should we have this fluctuation in this country? Why can't we have a steady rise? And that will only happen when more and more youth coming to that get involved. I mean, unfortunately, compared to Asia and Europe, till the Seattle thing just before 9/11, the American youth were more apathetic. And then all of a sudden 9/11 happened and they were pushed back. But I hope that that's going to change with Occupy Wall Street, and more youth will get involved and want to have a country where they will enjoy the freedom, to live with human dignity. And that's what people in Tahrir Square and in everywhere else are doing. So going out and talking and telling people, do not be afraid of this manufactured demon, but be afraid of those people who are abusing power. That's how freedoms die in small whimpers, and that's how you end up from democracy to dictatorship and police state. Thank you.
Just before I send it back to the audience, a couple of things. I think this discussion is extremely important in the context of the war drive against Iran, because the Islamophobia that has been mobilized against Iran since 1979 is part of the legitimation of the entire American military presence in the Middle East, and we should expect a wave of this stuff that's going to get nastier, because Iran and Syria, this is all going to be justified through Islamophobic means. One thing I really encourage people to do is these kind of panels do not happen that much in communities, on campuses, and we need to have a counter tour of people who are agitating against Islamophobia to counter the garbage that's being spent and said by these people that are paid for by the American government to go around and tour and whip it up. So set up panels, invite people like on these panels, but then local speakers as well, because there are people being targeted everywhere, without exception, all across the United States. And so you want to have the local victims, their advocates, and fellow activists up on the panels as well. And that I think it's really important to integrate this into Occupy, because the Occupy is one of the most vibrant sectors of agitation, and we want to make it very clear that in our movement we are going to oppose every form of oppression, and this is one of the nastiest, sharpest ones that exists in the United States today. And I want to underline how important it is that the Muslim Peace Coalition has come into being, as well as all sorts of other Muslim, Arab, and Palestinian activist organizations. And we, as people on the broader anti-war movement, need to stand shoulder to shoulder with them and take the positions that they advocate as our own, because we're all at stake. They divide both to conquer each. And so that whole spirit has to be brought into the Occupy movement and organized teach-ins, where at Occupy we bring a panel like this right into the Occupy movement as a central part of its political project. Sorry, I just couldn't help but say that.
That's great.
So
Thank you, Ash.
go ahead.
Okay, two factual questions. There's a Supreme Court case that seems to align material support with free speech, and I was just curious what the name of that Supreme Court case is.
Humanitarian Law Project, Holder against Humanitarian Law.
Okay, humanitarian. And then there was a book recommendation. Did you say Brown Skin, White Mask?
Yeah, Hamid Dabashi.
Okay, great, thank you. And then the larger question is, reading in the New York Times this past week, even some senators, Democratic senators, wow, how about that, raising these questions about this expansion, an expansionary reading of Section 215 of the Patriot Act, and that the ACLU and some other group was, trying to maybe a FOIA request, I'm not sure, just trying to figure out exactly what that expansionist, reading would be. And I was just curious whether anyone had been, following this, and how that pertains to, say the preemptive prosecution issues and the way in which that's used as a repressive measures against all the kinds of things that we've been talking about.
So I'm really glad people brought up both you and you were talking about the connections to the political, the politics coming out of struggles of Arabs and Muslims, both in the Middle East, North Africa, etc., and back home, supporting those struggles, etc. but also you just bring up like Islamophobia as something that's affecting the left, and I'd say even to an extent the far left. You know, especially look like in places like France, but also to be honest here. But I mean, and you brought in Iran. I mean, I think the question of Islamophobia comes all the time into what we're supporting and what we're facing in this fight against imperialist wars in the Middle East. In Gaza, a number of years ago, this comes out in, we can't support democratic rights of Palestinians because, they're electing Hamas. Now we're seeing, where there was elation facing the Egyptian revolution a year ago, now we're facing a lot more pessimism and, challenges, but the mainstream story that's being adopted is, yeah, they had the revolution, but now this is leading to the Muslim Brotherhood taking over, and so now we can't so confidently say, this is what we support, this regime that the U.S. backed being overthrown by their people, and taking it on and on. I mean, Yemen, where the target is, Al Qaeda, the model of the U.S. spreading democracy in the Middle East, Yemen, that's
right.
That's where that comes up, and just seeing this as a broader path of really ridding fighting Islamophobia as an ideology, both where it comes up out on the left and throughout society is such an important thing because it opens up all of these struggles, for the sort of right politics to emerge of support and solidarity from the United States.
Great point.
This might be a better thing to ask you guys after, but I'm actually from Chicago and I'm really interested in organizing stuff there, so I wanted to know if you have any organizations there that I could get involved with, or even just bringing, well, maybe like preparing for May 20th.
Yeah.
Organizing with you guys.
Yep. Other comments, questions? Yeah, over there.
I'm from Baltimore, and I've not too many, but the panel, I guess, some before. One of my kind of worries is about the left, and Islamophobia it seems in American society generally is more secular than it used to be. The left in particular, sometimes militantly secular, and therefore tendency to sort of, what is this? Religion part of it. I'm just against religion generally, and particularly that religion, and so somehow it's got to hold on to, it's going to be useful. I'm not part of the secular left, I'm part of the religious left, but as part of the left, that is a human value to your religious choices and so forth, and not to write this off as some sort of religion and therefore superstitious stuff.
Other comments, questions? Go ahead, Jimmy.
I have a question. I guess it's new to me that you can prosecute people based on what they think.
I didn't mean to make that face.
What?
I didn't mean to make that face.
Yeah. I mean, instead of what they do. Right? And I just wanted to know how that arose and why they wouldn't be able to extend it to U.S. citizens. What's blocking them or...
It already applies to U.S. citizens.
It already applies.
But I guess let's him finish the thing, and then
you were
we'll
saying
go back.
that it applies, that there's a distinction between what applies to people who are foreigners or foreign origin or something versus...
No,
we're not.
I'll
Okay, explain that.
Go ahead. Are you done, Jimmy?
Yeah.
Okay. Go ahead over there.
I was just wondering if the panel, if you guys had ideas or, just how to deal with fear within the Muslim community.
Yeah.
Like in terms of talking, I live in Brooklyn, with the Muslim community. On Ocean Ave, I go to this halal food spot, and me and the sister in there, we're about to talk, and we both were like, can I really talk to you, or can you really, what I mean? Just the issue at first.
Other comments, questions? Go ahead, Andy.
Well, first, thank you so much, sir, for your comment. And I'm glad a couple people brought up labor and how it's been the target of impact. You can really see that in Occupy. The whole reason Occupy exists, in my opinion, is that previous waves of repression against labor made labor officialdom totally quiescent because they were red-baited and we decided to shut up. And so there's been decades of no fight back until Occupy has begun to feel part of that void. But that only happened because there was also very severe and repressive and murderous targeting of African Americans and Chicanos and so on. And labor will break out of it in the same way that it broke out of the World War I repression against radicals in the labor movement. It broke out of it in the 30s. We will break out of the anti-communism that killed the labor movement. But for that to happen today, the prime task is for labor activists to fight against the attacks on Muslims and Moors and South Asians. That's the front line of the struggle now. And in the course of doing that, we can have this broader historical discussion.
Great. We're going to have to wrap up because we're actually over time. So what I'm going to do is throw it back to the panel in reverse order of how we started, which seems fair. So we'll do Lamis, Steve, Shaik, and then Deepa. And just before I throw it back to them, I did want to answer the question about Chicago because there's the Occupy Chicago movement, which is part of the mobilization against the NATO G8 summits. And there's going to be a People's Summit on May 12th and 13th in Chicago before the summit, which is going to be meeting on the NATO summit, which is going to be meeting on the 20th and 21st in Chicago. And so anybody interested in getting more information about the whole mobilization, feel free to come talk to me afterwards. And again, the sponsor of the panel has been the International Socialist Review, and there's copies of the magazine, the ISR, which are at the Haymarket table in the literature table section downstairs. And I really encourage people to get Deepa's forthcoming book on Islamophobia and the politics of empire, because I think putting Deepa on tour, as well as all these other speakers, if we could have this panel tour, I think it would be a great contribution to many communities and campuses across the country. So people should think of doing that, and getting reading groups around Deepa's book would be also very, very important, because a lot of ignorance dominates this entire discussion. I think this panel has given so many profound insights. So I think this needs to be done in many, many more places and before bigger audiences in which we really, really try and build it. So let's just do reverse order. Lamis, you kick it off.
Okay, so Jimmy, I didn't mean to make that face, but going back even to the seditious conspiracy laws, which come very early on in the history of the U.S. I mean, those are the climax of the antithesis to the right to free speech, right? Because dissent in whatever form is supposed to be the cornerstone of democratic participation, right? That you're able to dissent and change policies. So, I mean, that has changed into this material support, and what happens is, even though material support is to a designated foreign terrorist organization, is what Steve was referring to, what makes it more based on ideology and thought is that there's conspiracy. That's what most people are charged with. They're not charged with actual terrorism, violence to affect political change. They're charged with conspiring to provide support to those who seek to engage in violence to cause political change. Does that make sense? So conspiring to support those who might be it's totally removed. The vast majority of these cases are either conspiracy or attempt, and they establish the intent element based on what people say, usually egged on by the infiltrator or the provocateur. What's interesting in the federal system, it's very difficult to overcome or to prove the entrapment defense, because the government overcomes your defense of entrapment by establishing your predisposition. And your predisposition is established by your political beliefs. So if I'm supportive of Palestine and they see me out there in the street, and they can say, well, I was predisposed to commit violence against Israelis, for example. We have the one chance to prove an entrapment defense in the Farhani case, because in New York, one of very few states that takes the objective approach to the entrapment defense, meaning you don't look at the predisposition of the person, you look at the behavior of the government in setting up the entrapment. So this case would be really, really, really critical, and we might have a chance of winning it. I'll let also, speaking about being in prison for ideology, the difference between the way we treat our political prisoners and the way we treat mass murderers really speaks to how we treat, political ideology in the U.S. and political dissent, right? Political prisoners are kept in CMUs. They're in solitary confinement 23 to 24 hours a day. Mass murderers are not, right? Murderers are not. People who thought differently than what the establishment would like, people who are going to engage in conversations, political conversations with other inmates, are kept under the worst conditions. They're abused worse than murderers, worse than pedophiles. Going to the left, it's a tremendous problem, and I'm glad that the brothers brought it up. Absolutely, this idea that the left will loyalties will switch depending on who the people elect is the antithesis to self-determination. And who are we as the left of any other country to say that the people who are electing these parties are not intelligent enough to feel that they are being either properly represented or will have enough voice in this new government for it to be representative. And at the beginning of the revolution, or right after the initial phase, this one speaker from Egypt, whose family entirely was very active, said what you saw in Egypt was, Islam without its back against the wall. And all these representations and reactionary kind of Muslim movements are just that, reactionary movements to this, what seems to them an attack on their own, religious ideology. So what does, an Islam that doesn't have, or Muslim parties that don't have their backs against the wall look like? Well, sadly so far, the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt, very much unlike, the Muslim, the Muslim regime in Iran, is not anti-imperialist, in fact, right? And that's been a problem. So if there's going to be an issue with the Muslim Brotherhood, it's not because it's a religious party, but because we really have to question their class and imperialist analysis and relationships with the U.S. And that's exactly what the Egyptian people are doing, even those who voted for the Muslim Brotherhood. So the left is in no position to make those determinations, but really step back and say whatever it is that the people want is what we should be supporting, while mobilizing, and creating space for, anti-imperial activities and policy and whatnot, and supporting that. I think I'll leave it at that and let everybody else.
She said everything I wanted to say, but I'll just say it one more time really quickly, which is one way to think about it is that most of what these people have done was actually legal. In other words, they took a trip abroad. They witnessed a loan. They did something. All of it is legal. But what the government is saying is because they have an ideology which is somehow directed to support a foreign terrorist organization, you can infer from the fact that they did this act that they were doing it to support a designated terrorist organization, even though what they were doing was absolutely legal. Does that make sense?
Yes.
All right.
No, but yes.
All right. Shaik?
Again, answering the question from the left, I mean, it is a completely racist kind of a belief that the West think that they can impose their value system on another people. I mean, all human beings everywhere are the same. We all want to live in freedom and with dignity, want to make sure that our kids are not hungry and that they will not be killed, and that, want to enjoy life. I mean, so if the people in a land far, far away from here think that they can achieve those rights through a religious ideology, they will do that. And if they think that that religious ideology, given a chance, is oppressing them, they will throw that out. I mean, people rose up against the Shah, one of the most repressive regimes, against the Philippines. They would do that if the Muslim Brotherhood does the same.
Yeah.
So to think that, and also when an organization had been, for 80 years or 90 years they have been abused and they have been persecuted, they will try to be, to become more pragmatic. That's how, probably that's what is happening. So unless the left starts to respect self-determination, whether it's in, Palestine or in Kashmir or in North India or in Afghanistan, who destroyed this beautiful country? Yeah. The Soviet occupation of Afghanistan destroyed it for the last so many decades. They're living in hell. people in Afghanistan, their life expectancy is 40 years. Less than 40 years. Who made that? So unless we start to do that, unless we start to respect, individual freedoms and self-determination, and unless we start to rise up. One more thing, again, I'm pitching this time because the fastest growing extremist segment in America, the fastest growing, not only Islamophobic, but the extremist segment in America is this Hindutva philosophy. I mean, the people, tens of thousands of these people who are being trained to hate, coming here, getting empowered, and then nobody is aware of them. If you go to this website, Coalition Against Genocide, we founded this coalition which has both the left and the right and the center, and with an ideology with an aim of fighting this hatred, and we succeeded in getting the diplomatic visa of this powerful politician who would have been the Prime Minister of India now, had his visa not been revoked in 2005, and he thought that because of the help from APAC and others, it's going to be a piece of cake. So Narendra Modi, when he tried to come here, we got his visa revoked, and that shows that if we form a broad-based coalition, reach out, educate, and then put political pressure, we can get things changed. So I invite you to visit coalitionagainstgenocide.org, and I also invite you to write to Time magazine and tell them that from February 28 to March 15 was the time of this pogrom, and on March 18 they come up with a cover of glorifying this man. Imagine Time magazine doing that to Hitler.
Yeah.
He was Hitler in making. So we have to write to Time magazine and Brookings Institute. These two institutions came up with this. So thanks again.
Yeah, I do want to start with the left and two ways, I think, in which the left in the United States has fallen short in terms of pushing back against Islamophobia. The first thing to be said is that up until fairly recently, the anti-war movement actually didn't take up Islamophobia as one of its platforms, didn't reach out to Arab, South Asian and Muslim communities and make that a central plank. This is something that UNAC, the coalition that Ashley is a part of, has actually made very central, and groups like the Muslim Peace Coalition and others who've actually played a huge role in bringing this issue to attention. But what has the left done? I think on the one hand, the way you put it was absolutely right, which is the left has stood behind the excuse, the cover, that we're against all religion, and so we won't come forward and defend Muslims when they're being attacked. And this is just about religious freedom, it's about debate on religion and so on. Well, you've got to question the timing of when there's a debate about Islam, right? In the context of the Nazi Holocaust of Jews, if there was a debate about Judaism, would you take part in it? Of course you wouldn't, because you would see this as the first step in the process of demonizing an entire group, right? And so I think that cover cannot be used anymore. This is an entire demonization of Muslims as a way to prosecute a war on terror. Second, I think liberals have actually participated in justifying Islamophobia. And we have a whole wing of people who are liberal Islamophobes and liberal imperialists, and the two actually go hand in hand. I'm thinking here of Christopher Hitchens, whose book on God, whose name I've forgotten, and he says, well, religion has been the decline of all societies, but the biggest guns are targeted towards Islam. And so for Hitchens, the reason why post-invasion Iraq is a disaster is not because of the US occupation, but it's because of Islam. It's because of the Islamists. It's because of the tradition of Islam in this region. This is what he says. It's ludicrous. So I think we've got to, call out these people as well. And fundamentally, the mistake that they make is this lack of respect for self-determination that people have been talking about. It is the idea that, over the last 2 decades, the left in this country has bought into the idea of humanitarianism, the idea that the US state can actually be a force for good around the world. It can go in and rescue people in humanitarian ways and so on and so forth. And they have provided the ideological cover for these kinds of operations. And this is, of course, where Iran comes in, right? I've had discussions with people where the terms of debate really are, should we have let sanctions work, or should Israel go and bomb the daylights out of Iran, right? That's the range of debate. Never is it mentioned as to why the United States, the country with the largest arsenal of nuclear weapons, has any authority to decide who should or should not have nukes. And two, this is the only country to actually used atomic bombs against human beings, killing about 800,000 in Japan. What gives the United States the authority to decide? And if you think about it, it makes sense for Iran. I'm against nuclear armament, but it makes sense for Iran to actually acquire nukes. After all, it's surrounded by countries like Israel, like India, like Pakistan, and US bases, and so on, all of which have nukes and so forth. And so there is no, this kind of discussion is not had precisely because it's based on the idea that Iranians, at least since 1979, are these irrational creatures. They're just driven by this Muslim zealotry, and we can't actually have a conversation about them as rational people, and so we should decide what their internal policy is. Last thing I'll say is in terms of, the Muslim Brotherhood or even Ennahda coming to power in Tunisia. And the question is, how do we think about this? First of all, why have these parties come to power? There are a couple of contextual reasons why they've come to power. First and foremost, they are the most well-funded. Qatar and Saudi Arabia gives these parties large amounts of money, okay? And so they were able to use an existing machinery to actually go out and get votes. But it's also, if you read the work of, if you read the writings of activists in Egypt in particular, Mustafa Omar, the way he analyzes it, he says, look, this is like a lesser evil. People have looked to the Muslim Brotherhood and said, these people, first of all, have some credibility because they were repressed by the Mubarak regime. So they're probably honest. Let's give them a chance, right? So in other words, it's the kind of politics of lesser evil, and I've no doubt that the pro-neoliberal, pro-imperial politics of the Muslim Brotherhood will soon reveal their bankruptcy. But it is for the people of Egypt to then get them out of power and replace them with other alternatives, not for the United States and certainly not for the US government. So the last thing I'll say is, on the question of self-determination, I mean, one of the myths about people, particularly in the Arab world, is this idea that they are not capable of change, okay? This notion is called Oriental despotism. It comes all the way from the 18th century. Montesquieu, who was a French writer, said, he blamed it on the climate. He said in colder climates like Europe, people are active and vigorous and so on. In warmer climates, it's just so hot, all they do, they're supine, they're servile, and that's why they're destined to have despotic governments and so forth. I think if the Arab Spring has done anything, it has shattered this notion once and for all. No matter what the biases in the mainstream media in the US, they couldn't get away from showing Tahrir Square and the millions of people who were involved in these demonstrations. And I think that is going to go a long way in terms of, arming people in the anti-war movement, in the Occupy movement, to seeing Arabs and Muslims as allies in the same struggle against a system that is screwing all of us. That is systematically destroying all of our lives the world over. If in Egypt they fought against neoliberalism, in Wisconsin they fought against the same thing. This is why Scott Walker was called Hosni Walker, and why the slogan was "Fight like an Egyptian." So I think this is a moment of immense solidarity, as opposed to sympathy or what have you. Let's go rescue these people. This is a moment where we can stand shoulder to shoulder with our Arab brothers and sisters and our Muslim brothers and sisters, because there's a whole system that systematically oppresses us, and we have to fight together against it. So I'll just stop there.